Great. Thank you, Carrie, and welcome everyone. Hope everyone had a wonderful Thanksgiving. If you joined us a little bit early, we were chatting a little bit about Thanksgiving meals. So hopefully everyone had a good Thanksgiving and are getting ready for some more festivities later this month. But in the meantime, we want to talk about the economy, what's going on within the engineering economy, the greater economy. We've got two great experts here to talk to us today about that. Thomas Grogan, who is the chief economist for ACEC, and Joe Bates, who is our senior research consultant at the ACEC Research Institute and author of the Engineering Business Sentiment Study, which we're going to primarily focus on today, although Thomas has a lot of great content to share as well. So I will turn it over to the two of you because I know you have a lot to cover in our hour together. Joe, Thomas?
Thanks, Daphne. And Thomas, good to see you as always. Thanks for
Thank you.
being here as you always are. So we're just going to jump right into it. We do have a lot of extra slides today. We have some interesting slides from our hot topics section, which is something that we do with our business sentiment survey. So that's some brand new information that we'd like to share with you on AI implementation as well as H-1B visas. But before we get to all that, let's talk a little bit about the broader economy, which it's an interesting situation at the moment because we have data, but we don't have all the data that we normally would. It's important to note here that the sentiment survey that we're going to talk about was conducted during the government shutdown, and there's data that we do not have as well because the government was shut down, so the Bureau of Labor Statistics was not able to conduct its work. So you'll see something that I don't ever recall seeing before. I don't know about you, Thomas, but down in the middle of your screen at the bottom, it says next release on the Q2 or on the GDP is to be rescheduled. And you'll see that a lot on the BLS website right now. So, Thomas, do you want to just talk briefly about what data we're going to get, if we're going to get it, when we're going to get it, or do we even know?
I think a lot of stuff is TBD given the shutdown and part of the challenge with the shutdown is not releasing data, but then the other challenge was with the shutdown, the people who collect, do surveys, go out and record data. We're not doing those jobs either, so we can't use a time machine and go back to October 15th or October 20th and know what the price of cereal was at the time. So, when we talk about some of the other data series, one that we track a lot is the value of construction put in place. The data that would have been released October 1st did get released right before Thanksgiving. However, for the next 2 months of data, it's a little TBD. They are holding themselves accountable for at the beginning of the year, they'll resume the frequent beginning of the month updates. There has been a little bit now to focus on non-government data sources over the past few months, and I know we'll talk a little bit about some of those, but I think yeah, everything is still TBD. I believe yeah, certain labor data isn't going to come out until after the Fed meets, and there's a little bit of uncertainty around a handful of these things over the past 2 months.
All right. Well, with that, we'll share the data that we do have. So just keep in mind that we might have some holes in the data and we might be working with data that's a little bit dated at this point. But the last data we have on GDP was from the second quarter. They did release the final estimate of the GDP for the second quarter, which was a 3.8, a positive 3.8. That I believe was revised upward a little bit from the previous estimate. And then we also had, of course, a negative reading in Q1. Mainly what's happening here in Q1 and Q2 is the effect of the tariffs and how that has affected imports. So we saw, a huge increase in imports in the Q1 because people were front running the tariffs, and then we saw a huge decline in imports in Q2. So imports they subtract from GDP. So it's a bit of an up and down. But Thomas, you were saying when we talked before that you have a sense of what you think the full year GDP is going to be. Do you want to mention that here to try to help us with what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think to take a step back, there has been a lot of, I think, uncertainty and variance, right? And we see that in some of this data in the year starting with it being negative GDP, which this time a year ago, no one was forecasting that. And then we had a very big swing positive. The Q3 estimates from, other sources, including the Atlanta Federal Reserve's GDP now has it at around 3.8%. Then with Q4, which is going to be October, November, December, but the government shutdown is definitely going to dampen some of that. I think most people in the kind of economics financial world are expecting real GDP for the year to end up being around, 2% plus or minus. And if we were to go back this time a year ago, as everyone was putting out their 2025 forecasts, that was generally around the consensus. So, if we think about this time a year ago, not knowing what 2025 would hold, folks are still expecting, positive real GDP growth at around 2%. I think, it was more going to just be a smooth 2% as opposed to all this up and down that we're seeing and have seen. And so that is what makes it a little tricky when you're in the moment, to take a step back and think about the bigger, longer term picture.
All right, so we're expecting a decent GDP reading for the whole year, about 2% plus or minus. So not too bad there, but just a lot of noise in the interim. That's good news. On the other side, however, we're looking at the labor force, and we're not seeing things moving in a good direction. As you can see, in June and August, now with those revised numbers, we actually had negative job growth. So that means declines in the labor force. And that's the first time that's happened since December of 2020. So that was 5 years ago when we were coming out of the pandemic. And you can see very clearly here now a trend in the last, well, from June to September of increasing unemployment rates. So we may not know what the October number is, but this is kind of where we are. We're definitely at a higher level with at 4.4% than we've been in quite some time, which is not terrible, right? But I think we're also starting to hear a lot about people not hiring and not firing, and that seems to be some of a trend here recently. The labor force participation rate, which we always talk about, is actually starting to trend down a little bit now. It kind of goes up and down, bubbles up and down a little bit. It's still well below where it was in the month before the pandemic, and we just have not returned to that level. And I did a little bit of calculating on exactly what that means. So, today we have an estimated 274 million people that could be working. So what we're saying is 62.4% of them are in the labor market. Some of them are unemployed, as we talked about, but 62.4% are active in the labor market. But at almost a percentage point below where we were, that equates to 2.5 million fewer workers than if we had the same participation rate as we did 5 years ago. So that's a lot of workers that we just don't have in the labor force at this point in time. Now, when we look at consumer spending, again, we have to go back to August here, but the data we had was looking pretty good, 0.5% increases each month, June, July, August, so that's not bad. But again, our next release is TBD, as you mentioned, Thomas, so we're going to have to wait and see how consumer spending is holding up. But do you have any of your private data, anything that would give us an indication of how it's going right now, Thomas?
Right. So I think it was yesterday, the National Retail Federation, for preliminary holiday spending, estimated to be about 3 to 4% higher than last year. So, generally that is good, right? People on the consumer spending side, I think within that, the maybe risks or concerns that have come out is the increased reliance on the buy now, pay later programs. And so that is something that when we think about the economy as a whole and households, consumers, accounting for 70% of it, they're spending money because they have jobs to give them the money to spend. But if jobs are trending downward, then, reliance on, basically credit or, future earnings is definitely a risk to monitor. I don't think it's the end of the world in any respect, but it is kind of a one of those maybe more gray flags than red flags to keep in mind.
All right. So we've got decent GDP. We have unemployment on the rise. Consumers are holding up at the moment, but we're also starting to see an increase in inflation again. So we're back up to this is again the September, excuse me, the September reading, and this is the excuse me, the all items. And if you look at core, it also was at 3%. It went in September. So both of those numbers are at 3%. And right before tariffs hit in April, we were down to 2.3. Now it has kind of varied, right, Thomas? It goes up and down a little bit. But right now the Federal Reserve is cutting interest rates. Interest rate or inflation then could maybe continue. So it seems like maybe they're more worried about the workforce and labor situation than inflation. Is that your read, or do you take a different view on that, Thomas?
Yeah, no, I mean, that seems to be the consensus, and just based on the fact that they have cut, I think like 150 basis points over the past 18 months, thinking of their dual mandate of keeping low inflation and low unemployment. They're focused now more so on the employment piece. I think also with GDP being positive, but maybe, wanting it to be closer to that 3%, 3.5% growth. The thought is if things are slowing, some of these data series like employment, better to get ahead of that with the obviously potential that by doing that, you might be creating more inflation or have it be more persistent over the short term.
Yeah. All right. Well, we also will be getting PCE data. You're going to talk about that in a minute, so I'm not going to go into that yet. It's another inflation metric. But one of the first pieces of data that I'm going to share with you about the inflation concerns from the Business Sentiment Survey is that it is elevated. Inflation concerns are elevated. We use a net rating system for those of you who aren't familiar with this. So we take the percent of positive responses, subtract the percent of negative responses, so you get kind of on the balance. Where are we? And so in this instance, a positive number is not good because we're talking about concern regarding inflation. It's not as high as we saw in Q2, which was again during the tariff announcements. Q3 was over the summer when people were feeling a little bit better again. Overall, Q1, people weren't feeling so great, but now here in Q4, it seems like we're still elevated in terms of our inflation concerns. So when we turn to then the mortgage application or mortgage rates, we actually are seeing here, Thomas, like in the last 6, 7 months, kind of a trend downward from 7% to 6%. And I just want people to keep that in mind because you're going to talk about some of the construction numbers, which I think were a little surprising to me, but make a lot more sense if you think about mortgage rates are coming down by a full percentage point here over the last, 6, 7 months. So I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about inflation.
Right. And so this is kind of this, challenge, and why maybe the feeling around the economy when we ask for sentiment and other sentiment surveys about how people feel about the economy, a lot of those readings are at or near all-time lows, including the financial crisis of 07, 08, is that prices are continuing to go up. And so things, regardless of whether we're including food and energy in it or not, I kind of think using the CPI all makes more sense because all of us rely on food and energy in our daily lives. So to somehow take that out and then say, well, it's okay that that is changing more than the other doesn't really make sense if we think about it in the real world as opposed to theoretical. It's going up and up, and we haven't had this type of growth and inflation this persistent for 40 plus years. And things today are basically 30% more expensive than 5+ years ago. And so, that coupled with the employment numbers trending down is, indicators that the economy is cooling or to be concerned about.
And just to be clear, this is the cumulative increase, whereas I was showing that month to month, year over year. But this, I think, really helps to put it into context that, a 2% inflation rate is actually quite different from a 3% because of the
Right.
compounding over time.
Right. And we've been, at 3% as indicated in your chart for pretty much 2 years now, right? Like 2022 is when we had that real big spike. And then it was like, okay, we raised rates and things did start to come down, but they didn't come down to, pre-pandemic levels. And that has just been a very persistent piece of the economy.
All right, so here's the PCE data. Talk us through that.
Right. Well, mentioning how we had that massive spike in inflation and basically the beginning of 2022, we see that really play out in this chart on that black line, which is looking at the cost of goods over time compared to the gold line, which is the cost of services. And services is what the majority of household money is spent on. And we see that the goods, the physical things that get manufactured or produced or constructed started to rise more quickly than cost of services coming out of the pandemic. But once the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates, and thus making the cost of capital more expensive, thus making the cost of production more expensive, it basically flatlined, right? But the cost of services just keeps going up and up and up. And so if we are kind of in this new, I'd like to think of it as from 2023 onward, we're kind of in this new post-new normal. We had this massive shock in 2020, and then 2021, 2022 is a bit of the after effects of it. Thinking of 2023 onward, more normal stability. We're okay with this 3% inflation, which is still higher than 2%, but that services piece is still going up. That black line, the goods, is kind of this hot button that, I'm sure we will talk about tariffs and trade policy. If that starts to rise again, then I think, we're going to see a much higher spike in inflation, and that's going to be very much a pressing concern, which will then be problematic if we are going down the path of lowering interest rates to try to, stimulate employment. Then what do we do? Just turn around and start raising interest rates? That's going to be, the business financial community will have a serious problem with that because we all want certainty and we want, stability. So for now, the goods are not, moving significantly higher, but it is something to keep in mind and one of those, indicate data points to really keep an eye on.
All right, so here we're talking about consumer prices, but you also have some data on wholesale prices.
Right. So, this is looking at the costs of residential or non-residential construction compared to our AE services. This is not the most recent data. This was something we talked about, and one thing when I'm sure we will get into future sentiment slides we'll talk about, we all remember back in April, around April 15th, a lot of data series are just going down because of these trade policy announcements, big concerns it was going to impact prices. We are not seeing that impacting prices yet. Normally, though, that sort of stuff takes about 8 to 12 months to kind of trickle through. There's also a whole other challenge that we've talked about, which is there's a difference between policy being announced versus it actually being enacted and implemented, and also really keeping track of all of that. And basically, since this time a year ago, the cost of non-residential construction, which is, the cement, the steel, in addition to the wages of the construction people, renting machinery, et cetera, has only gone up 0.8%. Compared to the gold line, which is our industry's PPI, which is primarily our cost component of a project delivery, which is going up 2.12%. And since 2023, our industry's costs have increased 5x at the rate of the kind of construction component piece. So I think that is going to continue to be a challenge because we don't really see much of a slowdown there either.
All right. Well, this is a good segue into our next section about how is the AE industry doing.
Hey,
And
Joe, before
yeah,
we leave that, we do have a question I want to just throw probably to Thomas or maybe both of you, but
yeah.
some question around the Fed and the impact they're having on the market, the quantitative tightening, and the viewer is asking or stating, I thought that was ending on 12/1, wondering what effect this is going to have on a lot of the discussion you're having right now, I think, around inflation and so forth. So, any thoughts on that, Thomas or Joe?
Well, I think there's in theory, by reducing the tightening, that means credit will ease. But what we've seen and kind of what was evidenced, say that let's use mortgages as an example, the amount the Federal Reserve has reduced, the Fed funds rate compared to how much mortgages have come down hasn't been the same because mortgages are on the kind of open private or not private bond market, not just this intra-bank lending that the Fed can control. So it's kind of a way of saying the Fed generally can control things in the short term as best they can. However, it's the banks who ultimately will choose whether they want to lower their rates that they're going to finance capital at. However, the general thought is that over the next year, credit conditions will ease up, and we'll see that in some of the other data where industries that are more sensitive to the cost of capital have seen a little bit of a rebound since early summer. And some of that, including the residential market, is because credit conditions are loosening.
Okay. That's good information to share. Good question. Thank you from the audience. Keep them coming if you have any more. So, Thomas, this is an interesting slide to me because we had been seeing increases, month over month or quarter over quarter over quarter, and now in the last few quarters that you have data for, it's kind of evened out here, though.
Yeah, so when the year began, that Q1 value, we had our kind of first quarter over quarter decline in industry revenue. However, for the second quarter of the year, there was kind of that uptick by about 0.2%, still up 4.9% year over year. And so I think, that 4.9% year over year is probably more in line with like a long-term steady state growth compared to 2022, 2023, where we were seeing 12, 15, 18% year over year. I think also thinking about the first slide when we looked at GDP was negative. That was primarily because of net exports, but there is also a lot of uncertainty when the year began, and changes with respect to federal policy and workings and projects, kind of either being put on hold or delayed while, different government entities or, businesses were trying to figure out what was going to happen, having to wait on notices to proceed. if your agency is waiting on funding, but the department that's giving you funding is, going through a reorg or something like that, will slow kind of that project delivery. But it is slowing down a bit. And then when we look at the overall construction market, we'll see that, there are a handful of sectors that have, declined, that are, going to drive some of this change in our industry's revenues.
So we talked about overall U.S. employment kind of slowing down, and what are you seeing here in the AE industry?
So it has slowed, but it is still growing at about, I think the most recent data we got, which is for August, is up, or sorry, it's actually for September, was up, I think about 2.8% year over year, which is in line with our pre-COVID industry growth rate. So coming out of COVID, having 5.5% year over year growth in employment was kind of the norm in 2021 through honestly end of 2023. There was now, since the spring, a bit of a slowdown. August of this year was the first month over month decline in employment, but September rebounded again. So I think, our industry compared to the overall economy, and don't want to steal your thunder on some future slides, but there is work to be done. And if there is work to be done, then we need workers to do that work. And I think that is kind of playing out here. There also might be just a bit of, are we hitting a maximum? Is it slowing down a little bit because of, available workers, more so than firms and businesses cutting workers because business is slow.
Right. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So you got a couple more slides here before we get into the sentiment data. What's going on here with construction?
Right. So, now we could see that we had hit kind of a peak in May 2024 of total construction spending. That was about 2.2 trillion. And things have slowly been declining till about May of this year. But since May, it's starting to kind of go up a bit. Government has been performing just consistently, growing at a slow, steady pace, where this decline is coming more on the private side. And then as in a few slides, we'll dive into these submarkets. Two major things are, one, that cost of capital and how, the higher for longer interest rates, mortgage rates are playing out in certain markets, as well as changes in different federal policy, and what sectors are influenced by that. The positive is that August data that was released right before Thanksgiving did show a month over month increase, and that was kind of the first month over month increase in about 6 months. And private data from Dodge Construction, which provides a lot of the sample inputs to the census data, is showing that if this August data is showing a year over year decline of 1.8%, September is now only about down 0.7%. So September has grown as well. And there's some other data looking at starts in October that is showing an increase. So I think this line, instead of going down, is really moving sideways, which is, not the best, but definitely rather be moving sideways than going down.
Right. And then how about that residential construction versus non-residential? And how are the mortgage rates showing up here?
Yeah, I mean, we see that black line, residential overtaking non-residential construction coming out of the pandemic. And then when the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates and mortgage rates started increasing, that declined. It seemed like we had hit a bottom in the spring of 2023. And then, people were adapting to these higher for longer mortgages. And that basically from spring 2023 through spring 2024, it was slowly growing. However, in the spring of 2024, we kind of hit another peak and it had been basically going down. However, most recently, the low of May of 2025, we have the residential has been growing month over month since then. So I think it's kind of like how much gas is left in the tank with, mortgage rates still being, even though they're, down from 7.5%, they're still at 6.2, 6.3. How much further that can kind of keep going. And then we see, non-residential not growing at that real explosive high double digit growth in 2022, 2023, 2024. So, both those are basically kind of moving flat to slightly down.
All right. So which markets are doing better and which markets are struggling a little bit right now?
Right. So, I mean, what's doing good and calling out the larger size ones are definitely the ones around water. Not listed in a top five is also the kind of power energy market. And I think those are, in line with taking a step back, bigger, societal trends and needs. And so, population growth is continuing as well as kind of population relocation, for lack of a better term. And in certain states, they're still getting net migration. So, when more people are moving to a city or town, those are more resources needed. So you have things like the water supply and sewage growing. Then other growth areas related to the power and data centers and things like that are kind of those second order effects. For what has not been performing well, commercial, residential, and lodging, which are very much tied to, the cost of purchasing and developing land, we're seeing are declining. And then, the one thing I would call out, manufacturing, that's primarily declining due to changes in, federal industrial policy, things like the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act from 3, 4 years ago were spurring a lot of reshoring of EV battery plants or semiconductor facilities, things like that. And so that really is down more so as a function of the fact that it grew so high, it kind of has to come down. And that, manufacturing, even though it is down 4% year over year, total spend is still about $150 billion year to date, which is about, I don't know, well over 3 times higher than how much we were spending on manufacturing, pre-COVID a decade ago.
All right. So lots of good information here, Thomas. Thanks for
Yeah.
sharing all of this with us. We're going to turn now to the sentiment data and see how firm leaders are feeling. But Daphne, any questions before I jump into this?
No, I think we can keep pressing forward.
Oh, well, I did. So someone asked a question about data centers. So in the data that we were just showing, data centers, the census puts that in the office sector, which also includes offices. And so the office sector as a whole is only slightly up, mainly because traditional offices are down a lot, but the data center spending is kind of propelling that forward. So data centers are not classified under commercial or manufacturing.
And we'll see a lot of that in the sentiment data as well. The data centers is popping high.
Yeah. All right. So sentiment data, this is our three benchmarks here, the US economy, the industry, as well as firm finances. So let's start with firm finances. Very positive, plus 84. On our net rating scale, you can't get higher than a plus 100. So this is about as good as you can get. Firms are feeling very good about their situations right now. When it comes to the overall economy, these ups and downs are really very much tied to the things that have been happening in the economy. So the Q1 data was collected right around inauguration earlier this year. A lot of increase in positive sentiment and feelings about maybe a pro-business administration. Then we had Q2, which was the tariffs. So it took a pretty big decline. Actually, it's the largest decline we'd ever seen in the 4+ years of this study. Then Q3 in July, end of July, early August, people were feeling pretty good again. But now we had the government shutdown. Keep in mind, this was Q4 was fielded during the government shutdown, so we've seen a decline there that could be partly a result of the government shutdown. There could be other things at play as well. The industry sentiment is at a plus 72, and while that's still very good, right, it's very strong, plus 72. That is the lowest reading we've had in the entirety of the business sentiment survey. So there may be some of the this overhang of what's happening with the federal government affecting people's perception of the industry. There may be some other reasons that we don't quite know about yet. But again, just a little bit of softening there, but still very high. When we look at the condition of the industry, that's that current industry sentiment, and we break it down, we see that not only is it a declined overall, but it's declined in all but one region, more so in the Northeast. The South has been holding up, and interestingly, we haven't historically seen a lot of differences by region, but this year we've seen the South be a bit more positive than other regions of the country. Um, so that's something that's sort of interesting to watch. And then when we look at firm size, all of those sentiments down among all of them. And we do generally see lower positivity or higher negativity among smaller firms than we see among larger firms. And that's evident here. But again, overall, the numbers are still very good. It's just that we are seeing some declines here in the perception of how well the industry is doing. And especially compared to a year ago, it's down quite a bit. Looking at those sectors, which Thomas talked about, and we break them down a little bit differently in some areas. We do have data centers. This is sentiment, so how firm leaders are feeling about each of these sectors. Data centers is actually the highest sentiment reading at a plus 86. I believe that's the highest we've had in that sector ever, and might be the highest we've had ever in any sector. I'd have to go back and look over the years, but very, very high positive readings. Energy and utilities, as Thomas was talking about, that's being buoyed not just by construction, but by data centers, which are huge energy users, and so that's doing very well. Wastewater and water, we're doing well there, as you mentioned, Thomas. Transportation in terms of airports, roads, and bridges, doing very well there. What is interesting, though, when you look at the year over year column on the far right, we see more sectors have seen declines in sentiment year over year than we see improvements. And we even see those declines among those transportation, wastewater areas and residential land development. So there's a lot of areas here which are still positive, but are definitely down significantly from a year ago. When we look at backlog, this is something we track very, very closely and keep an eye on. We did see declines in Q1 and Q2, and I was getting a little concerned, but we popped right back up in Q3 in terms of our median, which is at 11 now. We have historically, since 4 years ago, we've been around that 12, 11 mark. So I'm happy to see we're back off of the 10, but it's something we're going to keep our eye on. And it's interesting because the backlog numbers, when you look at firm size, the reason it's declined in the last quarter was because large firms actually reported shorter backlogs on average than we had seen previously. So that's also something I thought was unusual because we typically see smaller firms having challenges before the larger firms do. So something to keep in mind, see what happens with our Q1 data. When it comes to hiring sentiment, we still see that 9 out of 10 firms have open positions. So, as Thomas was saying earlier, we don't have a shortage of need. And if hiring is leveling off a bit, it's certainly, I think, based on the sentiment data, because of a lack of supply rather than a lack of demand. We certainly have demand here that we're seeing. And the median number of open positions is at 6. It kind of goes between 5 and 6 from quarter to quarter. And so that has held up. We have not seen a material decline there. So the demand side is holding up very, very well. But I do think, Thomas, the supply side is perhaps going to be an issue. When we look at the open positions as a percentage of overall FTEs, We see that is down to 7%. We had been, especially last year, it was at 9%, 9% quarter after quarter. This year it's going down a little. So that just means that the total number of positions, open positions, as a percentage of FTE is declining a little bit, but still very strong hiring demand right now. All right, so let's take a look at the future and see what's coming ahead according to our firm executives. The future economy sentiment went negative again. It was at a +5 in Q3, down to -4 in Q4. Not a huge change, a bit of a change, but if you look at the data underneath, I talked about we take the percentage of positives and subtract the percentage of negatives. So what this means is essentially they're in balance, but it also means that we're very divided in terms of our outlook. We have about a third or so, 30% of firm executives are saying that they are more positive about the year ahead. They think things will improve. We have a third who think it's going to get worse and not improve, but maybe decline. And we have about 40% in the middle who say, well, I think it's going to stay about the same. So, on balance, firm leaders are saying probably steady as it goes. We also see just a slight increase in the engineering industry sentiment to a +10. We have, again, very similar kind of divided perceptions there. But when it comes to firm finances, we are improving off of that low of +17 in the second quarter of the year, and we're back up to a +35. So that's good news. Firms are still feeling like they're pretty positive. Things are going to be okay for the firm over the coming year. We look at the segments here again when it comes to economic conditions. This one is of the U.S. economy overall. So again, you see that those declines are pretty much broad-based across all firm sizes with one exception. And also again, here we see in the South it's a decline of 3 points, but it's not a double-digit decline, which we saw in the Northeast, Midwest, and West. So that's again, I think very interesting that we're seeing different perceptions coming out of firms that are located in the southern region of the U.S. Looking at future sentiment regarding these sectors, pretty much the same sectors are circled in blue, meaning that they're the highest future sentiment as we saw in the current sentiment. Manufacturing facilities, however, is also in blue there. But again, when we look at the year-over-year numbers, we see a lot of declines, more declines than we see improvements. So again, we're just seeing on balance, people aren't quite as positive, although they're mostly still positive, of course, but not quite as positive as a year ago. We always ask a follow-up question among individuals who exhibit negative sentiment regarding the future, and we ask why that is. So, what we've seen now since early this year is that political environment and political uncertainty, about 9 out of 10 individuals who say they have some negative perceptions of the future cite that as a reason. So that's pretty broad based there. And you can see it jumped up early this year from the 80s. And so it's been leading the way. Now, we still have a lot of folks who also are citing general economic uncertainty. You can select more than one of these, so that's why you can have one at 90 and another at 77%. But that's coming down just a little bit. Inflation and rising costs, that's coming down just a little bit over the last few quarters. Recession concerns are coming down, but these are all the top reasons. Impact of tariffs, again, sort of elevated concerns there as well, but down from what we saw in Q2, of course. What's interesting to me, and this, Thomas, I think comes at that government spending, right? The slow rollout of infrastructure spending bill, IIJA, we've seen that increase significantly over the last year. And I think there's a lot of concern among our firm leaders that perhaps will all of the funds be allocated? We know that about 30% of funds still have not been allocated. Another 40% have been allocated but not spent. That's a lot when we have just 1 year left in the IIJA. So, what's your sense of that, Thomas? Are you seeing that? Like, are we in jeopardy of monies not being spent from that IIJA?
I mean, I agree that the money is not being spent. at the pace or, expectations when it was announced 4 years ago, or, however, what ultimately will happen with that. I think that is an ACEC advocacy question, but it is a challenge. I know, a certain amount of some programs were, basically, for lack of a better term, canceled, and that money basically rolls back into the coffers and then will get, reallocated somewhere else. But yeah, that is, I would though be surprised because of, these are programs for infrastructure, and the U.S. needs, improved infrastructure, or in certain sectors, more infrastructure. And it'd be pretty hard to kind of not continue to, roll that out.
Okay. Well, we're going to keep an eye on that for
Yeah.
sure over the coming year. We also ask about future sentiment regarding backlog. So again, it took a pretty big hit in Q2 of this year following an increase in Q1. And we had been pretty much in the plus 30 to around plus 40 range prior to last year at this time. And we haven't quite recovered that, but we're positive. But again, there's this general sense of concern, a little bit of hesitation, a little bit of that uncertainty going into the next year. In terms of hiring, we actually saw a bit of a rebound in hiring intentions for the coming year. Again, that took a bit of a hit in Q2, but we're back up to a plus 57. Not where we were before that in Q1 and even Q4, but again, very, very strong in terms of overall hiring sentiment. So firms are not indicating that they're going to slow down in their hiring, and there's still going to be a strong demand for labor. What we did see, though, in the Q4 in terms of recession concerns was an increase to 45%. So that was up about 4 points, but again, still below the Q2 number of 54%, which was our highest reading that we'd ever seen. So elevated concerns about a lot of things. And I think that's the key, though, is that there are concerns. Like, again, look at those firm finance numbers. Firms are saying, I'm doing fine right now. But there's just this overhang that we've had for a while now of concern and whether that the good times are going to keep going. All right, so we have a few new items to share with you today, and then we'll have a couple minutes for questions. So please go ahead and ask any questions in the chat so we can get to those. But we asked a few questions for the first time, and we've included those in our hot topics section for Q4 2025. The first one is on AI. And in the full report, you'll see more information about this. This is just one of the metrics we collected. We asked about implementation of artificial intelligence in three different areas. One was operations, another was sales and marketing, and then the third was engineering, design, and consulting. So what I'm showing you here is the results for the engineering, design, and consulting, because this is actually the area where implementation has been the slowest. So you see that almost a third of firms say we have not yet done any implementation at all when it comes to design and consulting with AI. This is, of course, also very different by firm size. So you're going to find that larger firms are much more ahead of the curve, perhaps, than smaller firms. And that details in the full report as well. But for all of the areas that we've tested that I mentioned, those three areas, very, very few firms say that they're fully integrating AI or that they have widespread implementation. And the vast majority of firms are saying we're experimenting, we're implementing it in limited ways, and that's where the majority of firms are right now. So still taking those first steps into implementation of AI. We asked a lot of questions about H-1B visa issue that's kind of bubbled up in this past year and even in the last month or two. So we decided to gather some data because we had not asked these questions before. So what we found out was that almost half of firms say that they are employing individuals, at least one individual, with an H-1B visa. I was a little surprised. I had no idea what to expect, but I didn't know that it would be that high. And again, large firms, 500 or more FTEs, 73% of them say that they employ at least one individual with a H-1B visa. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, firms with 25 or fewer employees, 24% say that they employ at least one individual with an H-1B visa. So it is different by firm size, but there's some really interesting data on the next few slides that might surprise you even more than this slide. Uh, we asked what the average number, well, actually, I'm sorry, we asked the total number of individuals that were employed at each organization that hold an H-1B visa, and the average overall was 26. So that's a number we never had before. But then when you look at the firm size, we see that small firms with 25 or fewer FTEs have an average of two. So two out of those, 25 or less, which is actually a pretty high percentage compared to about 55%, 55 employees on average at firms that have 500 FTEs or more. So, this is a really, really interesting set of data here to help us get our arms around the extent to which firms are relying or not on individuals with H-1B visas. We then calculated what percentage of the total FTEs at firms are individuals who hold an H-1B visa, and we found that 4% of all people at firms are holding an H-1B visa. Now, this again does differ by firm size, and what's really interesting here is that 15% of those small firms that have H-1B visa holders, 15% of their workers have an H-1B visa. So that's a pretty high percentage compared to 1% of the largest firms. So then we asked if you could hire as many individuals as you would like to hire through the H-1B visa program, because as most of you probably know, we have a cap on the number of H-1B visas available to anyone in the United States. If you could hire as many people as you needed through the H-1B visa program, how many would you hire? And we see an average of 12. Now let's compare that to the average of current H-1B visa holders at 26. So you see that we almost have, if firms were able, they would almost increase by 50% the number of individuals they employ who hold H-1B visa. And among those small firms are telling us they would hire an average of 10 more workers. So that was remarkable. That was very, very surprising to me to see that. Daphne, you have any questions here?
I was just going to comment that stat alone from this whole quarter is the one that really surprised me, right? That you're going to go from 25 or fewer and add 10 more, and just shows the constraint that is on the small firms and their ability to grow.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and it's
I think
really remarkable.
yeah, and we've been talking internally a lot about um, the industry. The firms say that they're doing well, that their finances are good, but yet we don't have enough workers. And this is just, I think, underlines that okay, if we don't have enough workers, but oh, there's a potential pool of workers that we could tap into. Firms are very eager to hire more people. I think that's the bottom line here. The last question we asked, which has come up very recently, was the proposal slash idea that we would start to add a fee for H-1B visa applications, and that would be a $100,000 one-time fee. That was proposed by the administration. I'm not 100% sure if it's been implemented yet, but it certainly is being been talked about. Firm leaders say that nearly all firm leaders say that they would be less likely to hire an H-1B visa holder if they had to pay that $100,000 payment. So that certainly would put a huge damper on firms' abilities to hire individuals. All right, so that's all I have on the sentiment data. We've got a few minutes for questions. Daphne, has anything come in?
Yeah, well, a couple comments and questions. So back to the conversation around AI implementation. One of our viewers says that they thought our statistics matched closely with PSMJ's statistics around 96% of firms that have not gone beyond the experimentation phase. And their comment is, we have to get moving on use. If we don't use AI, it will use us. So I thought that was a good one to add. And then a couple questions, maybe for both of you. Um, do you think that the data that's coming out of the federal government is accurate compared to the private data that you have access to? I don't
Yeah,
know if that is a question
I'll,
because of the lack of data now, or if that's overall ongoing question, but however you'd like to respond to that.
yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm curious to hear what you have to say about it as well, Thomas. From my perspective, the data that I use, honestly, it's the best data I have. It's the most reliable data I have. It's not perfect. It never is. When you're doing data collection, survey-based research, other types of data collection and research that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does, there's always going to be some margin of error. There's always going to be ways you could improve it, but you'd have to spend millions and millions and millions of dollars more to make it perfect, right? So we can't make it perfect, but from my point of view, the data that I use, it's very reliable, very solid, and whatever challenges there might be, I think at least we do have consistent methodologies over time. So I look at those changes, and those I think are pretty solid. But Thomas, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're usually in line. They're also almost never the same, right? So, uh, whether it's the sample that the private source is pulling from compared to, a government in-person survey or, going out and collecting, prices off the shelves, I usually like to take as many data points and kind of combine them together, and you kind of then you see generally they kind of coalesce around a distribution. Who knows what the true number is, but it's mainly going to be within this range, and those ranges are never super wide. So I don't have any uh, issues with what federal data has come out to date. And I also think, if you have access to other data sources, use them as well. And they are, accurate in their own way. Yes, confidence interval.
Any thoughts, Joe, Thomas, on the Fed meeting, the upcoming Fed meeting, rate cut, stay put? What's your prediction?
Uh, I don't think they should cut rates, but I think they will. That's my short answer. Thomas?
Yeah, that is mine. It seems pretty, I won't say certain, but a very high likelihood they will cut 25 basis points.
There's a question about the full report, which we will be sharing with everyone. It will be up on the website momentarily. It will come to you via email along with a copy of this recorded session. So you'll have that in your email box as well. And with that, I'd like to just say thank you, Thomas and Joe. Thank you to our donors who make this research possible. Many of you are on the call, and we could not do this without your support. Thank you to all of you who are completing the survey, because otherwise we would have no data. So that is much appreciated. And here is access to download the full report. If you don't want to wait for your email, you can scan this. We'll leave it up for a minute. You can grab that report there. And obviously, there's a lot more detail there, a lot more breakdowns than we were able to cover today. But thank you so much for joining us, Thomas, Joe. Thanks for all your insights. And I hope everyone stays well. Take care.
Thanks. Bye bye.